Welcome to Basement Tales with Sam Jacknin, Charlie Einsmann, Ed Grass, and Sandra Delancy. We have fun telling crazy but true stories about turning the worst possible property disasters into bags of money. Along the way, we'll pass along some important lessons to help you make cash on real estate. Sam and Charlie walked away from cubicle hell 25 years ago. Starting with no property, they created their own Clear Sky group of companies, sold hundreds of houses, bought dozens of rentals, and made millions in hard money loans. I'm Ed, a big firm litigator until muscular dystrophy made me find a hobby other than suing people. I miss it. Sandra's the normal person here with a real job plus some rentals. Her decades of friendship with the group, from office flunkies to property gurus, might help keep us all humble and focused on learning something. I wouldn't count on it.
Well, it's up to you guys, but my tale revolves around bidding at the courthouse steps.
Okay, what happened at the courthouse this week or ever?
So
Is this a this week?
Well, it doesn't have to be.
I just got to pull it up. It's last week,
Oh, okay.
but it's absolutely par for the course. And there she blows. All
I
right.
should put a little advertising across here.
What'd you say?
I said I
Oh,
should
that's good.
advertising right there.
Yeah, I could put one on mine. It'd be advertising
Oh yeah.
right there. Yeah.
So my funny story revolves around bidding at the courthouse steps. Um, so one of the things that we do is we go to the courthouse steps all the time, and we bid on properties, whether it's Prince William County or Fairfax County or Washington, D.C. or wherever. And so this local jurisdiction auction that I attended was a fairly new property that was going up. The property was built in 2000 and 2012. And the way it works is we all pretty much have the same numbers. Uh, and so in the COVID world, we basically go by and check the property. Well, to all of us bidders, the property was definitely vacant, but it had not been rekeyed and it was really locked shut. And the garage door, it was a 2-car garage townhouse, 3 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, 3 levels. And so the garage door was shut too. I tried to pull it up, but I couldn't get in it. And this is important later on in the story, and I'll tell you why later. And so the garage door couldn't go up. The back door was a glass door, and the house had not been rekeyed. So it was pretty much impossible for me to get into. But I saw through the lower level, and the lower level was in terrible shape. But I did know it was vacant because the electrical meter was pulled as well. So the property was definitely vacant. And so in this particular case, we had probably 14 bidders. And so the way the numbers went is that the property after repair value was worth about 395,000. So it was 395,000 fixed up. And so everybody at the auction, they were investors. They were not owner occupants, and they were not trying to buy a house for their own use. Well, as the bidding started, one of my friends that was bidding with me, we both guessed on how high the bidding would go up to, as we normally do, because when there's 12 to 14 different bidders, especially in our neck of the woods, these properties get bid up and they bid the profit margin out of the property. So on a 395 after repair value, our bid amount would be somewhere around 310 to 315 would be our bid amount. And that includes buying costs, which are about 2%, holding costs, which are about 3%, selling costs, which are between 4 and 5%, and then of course a renovation cost. Keep in mind a renovation cost. And in this type of property,
But
a
right now,
renovation,
renovation cost is unknown, right? Because you can't get
yeah,
in.
the renovation cost is unknown, right? But we all knew it was vacant. We all knew that lower level was in terrible shape. And so that's kind of gives you a good idea what the renovation cost was. So my estimate on the renovation cost was between $40,000 and $50,000 because it's a 3-level townhouse. It's roughly 1,700 square feet, top 2 levels, 800 square feet, bottom level. So it's about 2,500 square feet. So you're going to need probably at least 40 grand to renovate it. And so what happened is that you had two particular bidders at the auction who had personality conflicts. So what they did is they bid each other up. And so my buddy showed me, he actually broke in the property and he took pictures of the interior of the property themselves. And the reason why I couldn't get in through the garage door is because he broke the garage door. He goes, "Oh, I must have broke the garage door."
On purpose?
so,
Was it on
so
purpose?
yeah, so he purposely broke the garage door so that nobody else could go in and look at the property. Well, he showed me pictures, and every single part of that property needed to be renovation. And there was some mold in the property, and the lower area had, and the lower level where the two-car garage was, had been drywalled off for another family to separately live in.
Oh, wow.
So somebody was going to have to come in and drywall the property.
Oh, wow.
Well, the funny part of the story was the bidder that won the auction had a winning auction price of $365,200.
Wow.
And the ARV was $395. So he's already losing money. And so the funny thing that happened is upon leaving the auction, the guy that won the bid, him and his partner, they both come up to me and they go, "How much can we get for the property?"
No.
Wow.
That's not a good time to start thinking about that.
It's a minute late.
What can we sell the property for? And so then, you know, me being as friendly as I am, I said, "I'm not really sure what your business model is." I said, "You know exactly what I know what you can sell the property for. Your list price is going to be $399.9. Even in this escalating market, you're going to get a $395 net. And so you've got $30,000 built in there for renovation, for buying costs, for closing costs, selling costs, and for holding costs." I said, "I already know the renovation is going to be 40 grand. So right now at 365, you're already down $10,000. So I said, "I'm not sure what your business model is, but you're certainly not following the same business model we all are following."
Did you tell him about your buddy who broke into the house and then saw law enforcement after that? You remember that one?
Which one?
We had one house a guy broke into, and he got busted for breaking and entering.
Oh yeah, and so yeah, so
a lot of people go look at these houses before they go to auction, but some of them get a little aggressive.
yeah, and for the general public, if a house goes to auction and it is vacant, keep in mind you're not allowed to enter into the property.
You're not even supposed to trespass on the property, walk around it.
Yeah, it's trespassing. And so this particular guy that we know, he was a habitual offender of trespassing. And so what went on in the past is that when he would break into these properties, neighbors would call the cops while he was still on the property. And so the police would show up and they would just give him a warning. But after the 6th or 7th time on different properties of different neighbors calling the police, they finally arrested him. And he had to serve a 3-month jail sentence for trespassing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
especially get in there, you break the garage door on purpose. I think that's
well, that's probably breaking and entering. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. Oh no, I am a lawyer. I don't know. I'm not a criminal lawyer, but that's probably breaking and entering, even if it's vacant.
Yeah, and so the owner at the time can press charges, but in his particular case, the state of Virginia pressed charges because he was a habitual offender. So they're the ones that press charges, and they pressed trespassing charges and threw him in the slammer for 90 days. And so this particular bidder disappeared for 90 days, and we were always wondering where he went because he was there at every auction. And so that's kind of a funny story to add on to my other funny story.
I know, Charlie, you're always thinking about, gee, should I make a profit here? But you know, that's not that sophisticated. You would think anybody could do that. How do I make some money?
Well, so in this particular case, our bid was about 310, 315. So let's say it was even at 315. And so that assumed maybe an 8% profit margin. So once the bid got up to, let's say it's even 10%, right? And our bid was 315 and you're trying to make 40 grand. Once that dollar amount got up to about 350, 355, you're in break even losing money range. So even at buying it at 395 after repair value at 365, they're losing at least $10,000. And these guys weren't people who are going to keep it as a rental. These are basically fix and flippers. And
That's what I
so
was going to ask, Charlie. Would I mean, it probably still wouldn't have made sense, but as a potential buy and hold to rent, and you don't make much in the way of renovations, could that have made sense? Could they have broken even with that and just held the property, or was that still a bad buy to hold as a rental?
well, in our case, it would have been a bad buy because in this case, the rent prices were only $2,200. So even at 365, in order to even get it rent ready, they're still going to need to spend $25,000.
Right.
Maybe it's not a full blown $40,000 to $50,000 fix and flip renovation, but they're going to need to spend at least $25,000 because, as I didn't cover earlier, the appliances were stolen as well. So even a basic rip the drywall out, you're going to have to paint carpet the entire property. Even with cheaper grade carpet, you're going to have to put in appliances and even fixing leaks in the ceilings or whatever else you might have. Oh, by the way, the garage door was dented and now broken because my friend broke it.
Another
That's at
1,200
least
bucks.
$25,000. So on a
Mhm.
365 plus 25 gets you 390. Plus their buying closing costs are about 2%. They're at $400,000, and so
So they don't make a penny.
yeah, they're at $400,000 with no equity and a $2,200 a month rent. Plus, you've got HOA expenses as well and taxes. So I don't know. That's in our book, that wouldn't be a good cash flow.
And what about, you mentioned about mold and about any of these buys. I would think mold alone would be, I don't know, what, 5 or 10,000 minimum, depending on how much mold is there. What do you?
Yeah, I mean,
how-
if you mold's a whole can of worms there. If you actually have mold that needs to be tested, then it could be more than 5 or 10 grand.
Mhm.
If it's just discoloration and it's drywall you can cut out, it's a small patch. It's not necessarily that big of a deal. But if you cut out the patch and then it's behind the drywall, it could be all up and through the ceilings and whatever. You'll be cutting out drywall until you have no drywall left.
Yeah, and these guys aren't going to do any remote mold remediation. They're just going to put lipstick on a pig. They're going to cut out the mold. If there's anything, behind the mold, maybe they'll deal with it, but they're just going to cut out the drywall, repatch it, paint it, act like the mold was never there.
Yeah, and people have to be cautious if a house has been vacant and they're getting it. You really need to take your time to make sure you're not buying a house with a concealed issue.
Yeah, and that's another good point too, because a lot of times at these auctions, if you have a rural property that's been vacant, and usually these rural properties are sitting on well and septic. So if that property's been vacant
Oh,
for
wow.
a
Yeah.
year or more, as we've kind of experienced a couple times, is that you might need to put in a whole new septic system.
You don't want to do that. You can never factor that in at the auction. I mean, you have to get
Right.
such a good deal. We've had a couple of surprise septic systems in the hundreds that we bought. We probably had two. One we had had a surprise that it was a septic system. Actually, two of them, both of them were surprise septic systems. We found one when we put a deck on and put the deck down into the ground and found the septic tank. We had thought it was hooked up to sewerage for various reasons. So that was no good at all because it was a very, very old system, and we had to buy a specialized septic system and have it all approved to replace it. And then the other one we bought, it was on a street with all sewer, and it just must have been the last house that never got converted to sewer. And we still have that as a rental. We did connect to sewer.
And even
but all
those
steps just connecting to sewer is not like a 10-minute exercise. You have to wait it out.
right. And even the first house that we bought, thinking it was public water and public sewer, the reason why we thought that was because the previous MLS listing had a public water connection and a public sewer connection. So that's why we were under the impression that neighborhood had public connections and that neighborhood did not. And so that was one of the, that was about 10 years ago, wasn't it, Sam?
Oh yeah.
That was a while ago, but yeah.
So actually the guy closed on the house. That was an interesting one. I think he closed on the house without having it fully upgraded yet, because we bought it and discovered it he bought it from us and we discovered it right at the same time that it wasn't connected to public, and he was patient and waited it out. He moved in, and then the new system was installed. And he was a nice person, but we ended up putting like $50,000 in an escrow account just to get through that.
Yep. Yep. So that's one of the things, especially at courthouse buys, you've got to be very careful about the well and septic types of issues because, like Sam was saying, even putting in a brand new septic system is going to run $25,000 to $35,000, all depending upon what you put in.
Yeah, or connecting to sewer would be 15 grand or something like that.
Yeah.
Plus, just you immerse yourself in things you don't want to know about. It's not like a one-stop shop to do either of those things. You can't just call someone. No contractor wants that work. No individual service provider will do that work. So you have to become all involved.
So maybe we're backing our way into the topic for this week again, as usual, is maybe how you evaluate buying properties at auction. There's that auction.com stuff. There's courthouse auctions. You started to talk about some of and I suppose I don't know exactly what auctions are doing right now with the whole pandemic. I think we talked a little bit about that on one of our podcasts, but what's going on, how do you assess this? I mean, this septic issue sounds like a potential bombshell. I think you seem to say if just the fact that it's sitting there without being used can cause problems, but if somebody wants to get into the fix and flip game and buy a property through auction, how do they do that?
Well, they need to monitor the auctions and see what's coming up. And I would recommend your first flip be in a cookie cutter neighborhood or in a neighborhood that's well established and not a rural property or some really oddball property that doesn't fit into an urban neighborhood. I wouldn't buy a residential house that happens to be surrounded by commercial or something like that. You want something that's simple to understand. That's your first one out of the gate.
Yeah. And not only that, you also, if it is an auction, you're buying it as is, where is. And so basically what that means is all the risk is on you. So not only the renovation risk, but more importantly, the occupancy risk. So you have to, my vote would be to buy a property that's vacant as your first property. If that's what you're
Oh, for
doing.
sure. And certainly don't buy it without walking in if it's occupied and knocking on the door and talking to the person who's living there and understanding what their needs are, because you don't want to get yourself involved in an entire eviction process on your first go round.
So are you thinking it's better to try a direct wholesale purchase first if you can, or is it okay to start with auctions, or what?
With wholesale, you still have to make sure it's vacant. You have to go there yourself and establish occupancy. You can't rely on someone else to say, oh yeah, they're out of there. That doesn't work out too well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then the other part of that process is you got to understand if the occupant is a tenant or an owner occupant. Because tenants have different rights than an owner occupant, so you might get stuck with a lease that isn't in your favor, and so that's part of the evaluation game as well. But if you're going to go up and knock on doors and talk to people, you just got to be, just be careful and be very polite, and also be also knowledgeable of the fact that this person could be going through a stressful situation. So you just got to be careful in talking with these people. But 9 times out of 10 they are very friendly, and they're forthcoming. They'll give you a lot of information if you approach it the right way.
I'm like Ed, I'm trying to figure out what the ideal kind of first time investor property would be for like a fix and flip. And it sounds like all of them, you need to do some type of due diligence to know who's in it, what their repair costs might be. And, all of that may be overwhelming for someone who doesn't know what they're doing. Would you recommend that they work with someone who knows what they're doing?
Yeah, that whole, that connection to a wholesaler is helpful, because hopefully the wholesaler has done some of the due diligence, and then the end user can just verify it.
Yeah. Because I think if you're a first timer, I would definitely not approach buying at the courthouse steps as your first approach, nor would I approach buying an REO property on auction.com or Hubzu or Exome or any of those type of websites. We have one of our hard money loans just happened to me the other day. Matter of fact, I've been talking to this guy for 3 weeks. This poor guy, he bought an REO in Maryland. Well, I'm sorry, he didn't buy the REO. He's under contract to buy the REO in Maryland, and the property is occupied. And so he came to us with a hard money loan. And the first question I asked him, especially in the pandemic environment, is the property occupied? And of course, he came back and said yes. And then I said, well, what are you going to do with the occupant? He goes, I don't know. My realtor is handling it. I said, what are you talking about? And so he bought this house for about $350,000, and he's got a $35,000 non-refundable earnest money deposit. And so I told him the other day, I've had so many different emails with this guy. I said, look, we are not going to fund this property if it's occupied, not in a pandemic. I said, you're going to get absolutely annihilated with holding costs. I said, you at least got to talk to them and get a keys for cash agreement going, because you're at least a year away from getting possession of that property. And so I haven't heard from him in the last day or two, but odds are I have a feeling that this guy is going to lose out on $35,000. The house is in a cookie cutter neighborhood, but it is occupied with, I believe, the former owner. And these guys know the system, and they're not going anywhere. So either this guy, poor guy, is going to buy the property, or he's going to lose his $35,000. And so,
What do you think the property is worth as it sits there?
5.25, 550.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, couldn't he buy it and just wait out the? I guess it's getting the loan.
Yeah.
He can't wait out a year or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's right. Because he cannot. The only loan that he can get is a hard money loan.
Right.
That does not require an appraisal, because to get a conventional loan or a VA loan or an FHA loan or even a community bank loan, they need an actual interior appraisal. And so if you've got a hostile occupant in there, they're not going to let an appraiser in the door, which means they're not going to get an appraiser. And nobody but except a hard money lender will loan to what's called an exterior BPO. And so his only choice in this game is to get a hard money lender that's going to be willing to do it. Now, I guess if he puts a substantial down payment down, then we'll go ahead and do it. But he hasn't raised the white flag and say, you're the lender of last resort yet. But if he does that, I might say, okay, put $100,000 down. We'll go ahead and fund it, just to make sure that we're protected. But that hasn't happened yet. But he has to go with a hard money loan.
But it also shows you why people do cash for keys, right? I mean, what do you think a guy like that should be, quote unquote, willing to pay? Sounds to me like $25,000 to get the person out would not be too much.
Yep. 25 grand. I was going to start at 10 grand, right? Everything
Right.
At that level starts at least 10 grand. And Sam's got a good story about a keys for cash agreement that we did in Washington, D.C. on one of our bank REO properties. You remember that one?
The one in Florida, on
Yep.
Florida Avenue.
The one on Florida Avenue.
That was our first one in DC that we did. We did a bank REO keys for cash, and I wish I'd bought that property with you, Charlie, back in the day, because that turned out to be a great spot right there on Florida Avenue.
And how much did we give her? How much did we give her for the keys for cash?
It seemed a lot at the time, right?
Well, we had to do two things, right?
So we had. So she hadn't been paying rent. So she was in an investor's home, and in the district, she was receiving a subsidy, and she claimed that none of the light bulbs worked in the home, and the ice maker didn't work in the refrigerator, and so she wouldn't remit any more payments to the investor, and the investor was sort of unfamiliar with what to do and how to deal with these problems, and it was right into 2008. And he just threw up his hands and didn't pay his mortgage, and they just yanked it out from under him and foreclosed. And the bank took it back as an REO property. And so come to pass, they sent it to us as a listing, and then said, Sam, go down there and see what you can do to get the folks to move. So Charlie, maybe you remember more details of what happened. I remember on the day of the move out, it was pretty dramatic. They had like a 12-year-old boy handling all of the moving responsibilities with someone that he hired at the neighborhood store who was drunk. And so it was quite a fiasco, including the dog that didn't like me so much. So what do you remember about the keys for cash part of it?
Well, to get back to Ed's statement earlier, for us, it wasn't us paying the money, because we were just agents representing the bank. And so, Ed, this was a record keys for cash. This occupant got $20,000 back in 2008.
Yeah, 2008. Yeah,
and it took us at least 3 to 4 months to finally come to that agreement.
Yeah.
Well, I know you guys remember the one much more recently that I know about. Didn't they? There was an attorney that got involved who was I mean, basically what this attorney did was find people that were in houses that got bought at auction and just try to extract money from the buyers. And I think his opening demand, his keys for cash was $150,000, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a bit.
Yeah. Now we haven't covered all the dimensions of that story, have we? On another
That's
podcast.
That's a podcast in itself.
It easily could be.
Sandra even had a chance to come and meet some of the neighbors at that location.
Oh yeah, well, Sandra, what happened with that? We can tell that part of the story. What did you go there for, and what happened? I can't even remember the story exactly.
You found the meat.
Oh, was
meat man.
Keys for cash?
Well, that was part of the fight. Was about it's a whole story, but I just remember why did you go there?
I thought for some reason they eventually moved that. I didn't realize it was a keys for cash. Yeah, there
was that too.
Yeah.
It was keys for cash. It was.
I wouldn't call that a keys for cash. That was a legal settlement.
Yeah.
Keys for cash.
Like that.
That was a legal settlement.
Who did you see there, Sandra? Was it like a neighbor cooking meat or something?
No, that was the one where we had gone in and met with a contractor earlier, right, Sam?
Yeah.
The one with the tricked out, I think it was a Cadillac Escalade or something.
Mm-hmm.
Impressed us with. But we came in there and there was a neighbor. Well, all the electricity, all of the utilities were still on. So everything was still on. The house was, up like 4 feet up with like stuff, all kinds of stuff in the house. It was out high with, belongings. So somebody obviously was living there, very recently. And the utilities were still on, including the refrigerator and a deep freezer that was in the kitchen. So I went there one day, I don't know, to take pictures or something. I'm not sure what I was going there for. Get some shoes or something, because there's always some good stuff in these houses. So we went past there, and there's a guy, I come in and I do the, the knocking, the hello, coming in, all that stuff. And there's a guy at the back of the house, waist deep in a deep freezer, saying that the owner told them to come and get the meat out of the freezer.
And the window's broken right beside where he's entered the house.
No, they come in through the upstairs window. I'm like, well, how they got in? They weren't breaking windows. They were coming in, legitimately. They propped a window open upstairs. Had a
Wait, coming in through an upstairs window is not coming in legitimately.
Was not breaking, entering technically. There was no breaking going on.
Right, that's true. No breaking.
They entered an upstairs window with a ladder.
He was just trying to get meat out of the freezer.
He was just trying to get those steaks that someone had left in the freezer. So
is that code for a body? Like the prior? What do you mean? Was it actual meat?
There was actual meat in the freezer, and I said, I don't see you. You do what you need to do. You get your meat, and you need some bags, or the bags. It found some old, old grocery store bags that had, holes in them from, the rats or whatever eating through them. But he got enough bags to put his meat in. He walked out the back door and locked it,
Locked it behind him.
Yeah, but that's also the same house with the bones in it.
What?
Oh, that's right.
And so maybe that's where the meat came from.
That's the same house where we found the bones by the...
Oh, maybe this should be our Halloween special podcast.
Yeah.
When we I don't know what the timing is. Maybe
So
we have to, maybe next week.
So I got a call on the same house while the guys were working in the basement, and they said, Sam, we've had a problem. We've come across some bones. And I said, well, I don't know everything about this sort of situation, but I think you should maybe stop where you are. And on Ed's advice, we called the police and sent them down there. And the police said it was inadequate, the amount of physical evidence that they had identified. So just to keep going. And so I got the case number and so forth on that for our file, just in case anyone were to come back and ask. But those are the bones.
I would just like to toot my own horn here to show you what a sophisticated attorney I am. You told me there was potential human remains in a house you were working on, and I said, let me put my 25 years of legal experience to work. And I said, I maybe call the cops. And turns out probably we didn't have to, I guess, because they were not interested. But I'm going to say, I don't represent people listening to this, but I would say if you find remains that might be human, I'd call the cops.
Okay, so
Start
what
with
do you
that.
mean by might be human? Like,
The contractor was pretty
they
certain it
weren't
was a
like
human.
bone size. They were like human bone sized, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. Well, there was clothing affiliated with it too, I think.
You know, I don't know. I wasn't on site to see what happened exactly, and I didn't get a photograph of the evidence. But whatever the police found when they came was not adequate.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like you found some chicken wings that
No,
somebody was enjoying.
No, it was down like near the furnace in a place where you might throw a body if you had.
Was there like a glove that had blades on it, like a Freddy Krueger glove? Was that there? Because it was by an old furnace, wasn't it?
I don't know, but those shoes that you got, Sandra. It's hard to know.
Oh no! Whose shoes?
Because they thought it was a dress associated with them.
There were no bones in the shoes.
That's certainly so. I guess that was when you guys bought that at auction, and somebody had done an occupancy check for you, and they were not correct about the occupancy, and it turned out they were occupants. Yeah,
I still remember. It's 90% vacant.
It was the 10% that was the problem. It was just that last.
If you looked in the window, it was like 185% occupied.
That's the thing. You couldn't look in the window. There were two doors.
Yeah.
There were two doors, and so there was nothing to look through the window. But there was a cord coming out of the house into the next door neighbor's house. So obviously somebody was probably stealing power. I didn't realize that until after I saw pictures of the house, until after we had purchased it.
My understanding is that cord where we thought the power was coming into the house was actually going out of the house so that the occupant could do work on the neighboring property. It was absolutely the opposite of what we thought, what we were told.
Right. And so that was actually a auction type buy. That was a purchase that a bank went and foreclosed on somebody. It was an auction. That was an auction style purchase. Yeah.
Well, and it shows you that, DC it's particularly important to know about the occupancy because DC traditionally renters or people who are squatters but claim to be renters or whatever have quite a lot of rights that can delay. I don't mean whether that's right or wrong. It's just a fact. And so it delays the process where the same exact situation in Virginia, you have a pretty good chance that you could do an eviction pretty quickly. And I guess Maryland somewhere in between, but depending on the listener's jurisdiction, they better have a lawyer in mind if they're going to have to do an eviction if they're not a lawyer themselves, and factor in that pricing. I mean, you guys know enough to know if something's occupied in DC, you got to add a lot of money to the or reduce a lot of money for the auction or whatever it might be.
Yeah, well, we sold, and I don't know if this wraps it, but we sold 4 houses at auction that came back from a single borrower. And the only one that sold that we didn't take back was the worst condition, worst value, because it was so clear that no one was living in it. And the other ones, they had closed up and made it look like they were occupied. And then so no one would buy them at auction. But it turns out, that worked well for us, but not for auction buyers because they didn't know.
Because in other words, you guys were the banks on those.
Yeah, we knew them to be vacant. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why the story that I first told, why that price went to the stratosphere was because, to all of us guys that went and did an occ check on the house, it was very obvious it was vacant. And so when these guys see vacant houses, they salivate and they just jack the price up. Now, jacking the price up into money losing territory isn't cool, but that's exactly what's been going on is when the property's deemed vacant, they just bid that thing way up because they ain't got to deal with the occupant.
Yeah, are the number of foreclosures down and people are overpaying consistently? Why is that? I mean, this is not the only company or bidder who's paid too much. It's pretty common now, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's very common because what's going on with all the moratoriums and all the everything going on out there with the banks, especially the government-sponsored loans is that they're not foreclosing. So the only loans that are actually getting through to the auction block from a foreclosure standpoint are the properties, are the banks, are the where the mortgage holders are investors. And oh, by the way, if it is a government-sponsored mortgage, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, VA, FHA, if the property is deemed vacant, then they can foreclose on it and send it to auction. And so what that means is that most of the properties now that are coming to auction, which are very far and few between, are vacant. And so they're getting bid up really, really high.
Right, because didn't we were talking about this the other day that if even if it's an investor property and they've got a renter in there, they can't even evict the renter, or if you buy the house with the renter because of that CDC thing that says basically you can't evict a person because it might increase COVID, and therefore CDC prevents you from moving them out, and that's at least through the end of the year, I think, if not longer.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's the whole market's froze up. But do some of these other bidders, they just have a lot of money sitting around? I mean, shouldn't they just wait for the prices to
Yeah, I
come
mean, they
down?
should all wait, but what they're doing though is they're gambling, right? So a lot of these guys are gamblers. And so what they're doing is they're like, oh, I can shortcut the renovation process. So I could cut corners here, I could cut corners there, and I could save a couple grand here, a couple grand there. But what they don't realize is in order to get it to the max after repair value, they've got to put in a pretty good renovation, and they can't cut corners, but that's what they're banking on, is cutting corners during the renovation process.
Yeah, that's a tough one because it doesn't work out well. You're trying to, your renovation cost is a small percentage of the overall asset, right? So you're going to save 10% on what's 10% of the cost. You're going to save 1% in your transaction, but then end up hanging on to the property for an extra 3 months and lowering your price and all this other stuff. It just doesn't make sense.
Although I guess we were talking about this a year ago that people were overpaying. I guess maybe it wasn't so bad a year ago if you overpaid because the market ran up.
It
so
went up
much.
about 12%. Yeah. So
Right. So maybe they're thinking, well, I'll roll the dice again.
yeah, but that's not a good move.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
right.
that's just an absolute terrible move because, what we've always done for the past, I don't know how many years, 12, 13, 14 years, is that we always buy what's called present value. And so we buy into present value. And so if the market goes up, that's just icing on the cake. What's happening in our area, because the market has been going up for so many years, that these guys are bidding on the future value. So they're adding 5 to 10% on the after repair value, and then that becomes their bid number. And that's just a dangerous game to play, because once this market peaks out or even stays steady for a number of years, I mean, they just overbought by the increment of the percentage of their future value. And so we don't, that's not a strategy that we will do or even ever
Well,
have done.
Sam always says I'm a doomsayer. I guess that's lawyers are always looking for the downside. But I liken the current situation with COVID to when, for the oldsters out there, when the coyote runs off the cliff and he's running in space and he suddenly looks down. He realizes like I'm off a cliff and gravity kicks back in and he goes falling down the canyon. I kind of think that's where we are now. And I have to be honest, I said that 8 months ago, 7 months ago, but I think that's just continued longer than expected. Wile E. Coyote's gotten out over that gap, and at some point, gravity's going to kick back in. Hopefully, I'm still wrong. We'll see.
No, I mean, we agree. We've agreed with what you've been saying. I mean, I remember even a year ago, going back into last Thanksgiving and last Christmas, we put a kibosh on our lending criteria parameters. And so what we did is we were very conservative on figuring out the after repair value, and we were factoring in a depreciating market even back then. And so then once COVID hit, our parameters were exactly the same. And so we just factored those same parameters into a lot more conservative lending environment. So we thought the market had peaked a year ago, just like you did.
Yeah.
No, this really doesn't seem like a market for new investors, Charlie.
Well, it goes back to your point, though. I think, I can't remember, maybe it was you, Sandra, had said, maybe auctions are not the best place to start but if you have a relationship in a neighborhood and you can buy directly, for cash or quickly from somebody who has to leave, that could still be a very reasonable deal because you're not competing against 10 different overpaying auction people. So it's that, that's another podcast for sure. But the network game that Charlie also does of trying to beat the bushes to find, gems in the rough, that maybe that's still there, but that takes that much more work, of course.
Yeah. Okay, so don't dismay.
Yeah, that networking is still there. I got approached by a realtor today. He specializes in estate sales, but what he has to do when he represents the estates is he has to put them on the market in the MLS. And so we had purchased a couple properties from him. The last one being on Bower in Rockville. And so he came to me today and he said, "I'm putting this property on the market. It's a Northern Virginia property. I'm listing it at such and such, but I have to do it because I have two appraisals that says the house is worth this much. Oh, by the way, it needs a full rehab, which means it needs $120,000 rehab."
Oof.
Well, the tax assessment was about 520,000, and so he's going to list it for 570. And so I texted him back and said, "Hey, look, that's a high price." I said, "I don't think you're going to sell it." He said to me, frankly, and this is where the networking part comes in. He goes, "Oh, I'm definitely not going to sell it." But he says, "Give me 30 to 45 days of it being on the market, and then you can submit me a lower offer, and then I'll accept the lower offer." Now, the caveat to that is,
He wants
he's
to
the
close.
No, no, no. Not only does he want to close, but he's the listing agent. So he's going to get both sides of the
I
commission.
see.
He's going to get the listing commission,
I see.
plus he's going to get the buy side commission. And so he likes that. And so he said, once it's been on the market 30, 45 days, I'll reach back out to you. You just make me an offer. I'll get it approved by the estate or whatever. Then you guys come in and renovate it. And so he just said, put that on your radar. But that's part of your network, right? And so that's part of growing your own network, because your own network is central to you. And that's from a new investor. That's what you want to do, is you want to build your network.
All right. Well, maybe that's our podcast for today. Be careful out there. As like Hill Street Blues, they used to say, be careful, but there's still bags of money to be found.
We're rolling. Do you know what we're talking about today?
Well,
I don't think we ever know what we're talking about.